Hello, I'm Todd Johnson, and this is Earlylands in Conversation. Today we look at the Baltic region, which has been repeatedly in the headlines of late as it sits on the front line of NATO's physical and rhetorical face-off with Russia. Just a few days ago, Russian military aircraft penetrated Estonian airspace for 12 minutes, in yet another challenge to the Western Defense Alliance. With this in mind, we are extremely fortunate to have with us today Oliver Moody, who is the Times of London's correspondent in Berlin. Oliver also published early this year the book Baltic, which has been called, quote, a timely analysis by the Financial Times and, quote, fascinating and essential reading by noted political economist Helen Thompson. Oliver helps us understand a region that too often is ignored in discussions about Europe, but which he argues now plays an absolutely critical role in geopolitics. I'm very pleased to welcome Oliver Moody to Earlylands in Conversation. Oliver, thank you very much for joining us today. Are we catching you in Berlin, I presume?
Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm thrilled to be here. And yes, you are catching me on one of the last days of this German summer.
And you're there, obviously, in your role as the German correspondent for the Times of London, correct?
Yeah, the job title is the Berlin correspondent, which is relevant because it's one of these kind of weird Cold War hangover jobs, which is also responsible for like half of Europe, which is how I came to write this book.
You are still at the center of a lot that's going on beyond just a fascinating country, right? To start off, I love the book. You know, it's truly one of my favorite reads of this year. And, but that said, you had me at the word Baltic. My wife and kids are dual US Latvian citizens, so there's no reason or no need to sell me on the region's importance. But for those of our listeners not married into this fascinating part of the world, why should they care about the Baltics? What led you to focus on a far too often forgotten part of the world? And I think you make a very compelling case that the region is actually at the very center of geopolitics. Tell us how we got here.
Yeah, so I moved to Berlin in 2018, and traditionally the job had been very much a Germany job with the northern and eastern neighborhood tacked on as an afterthought. And
right.
I spent a few years trying to get to grips with the eccentricities of Germany's unique political environment. And I found myself getting quite frustrated at how stuck the German conversation seemed to be on some of the central questions of our time in Europe, like security and Russia and energy. And I found myself looking outside Germany and discovering that there were other very different perspectives in Poland and the Baltic states. And after the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine started in February 2022, we also saw a real revolution in security policy in the Nordic countries as well.
Right.
And this amazing moment of convergence of perspectives. And I was trying to make sense of this moment by reading whatever I could. And it turns out that there are a superfluity of good popular books on Germany and Russia. There are some on Poland. There are a handful on the Baltic states. And the Nordic countries are really not as many as you would expect. But
right.
Outside academia, nothing on how all of these countries fit together as a region. And so I decided I would do the research myself and write that book.
I was telling you, how I first came across the book, actually, when I walked into Hatchard's, the famous bookshop in London. Just sitting right there at their, kind of entry table, aka the important books of the hour. So obviously you are publishing into an environment in which the world is starting to understand that the Baltics are not this obscure corner of the world, right? They're actually at the front line of, as we were saying, geopolitics. Did you find that an easy case to sell when you were coming up with this thesis for this book, and when you're discussing with others that was the line you were going to take, and I think you very effectively make in the book?
Yeah, well, 100%. The publisher was super receptive to the idea when I suggested it. And I think a lot of the points that I make in the book, particularly around the centrality of the Baltic as a region, the fact that it is a coherent region, and the fact that its approach to security is something that Europe as a whole and the wider West should be adopting, have really gone mainstream in the time that I was writing the book, and especially in the 12 months since I clicked send on the manuscript, which is kind of gratifying. And, you realize you haven't gone out completely on a limb and you're not crazy. But at the same time, it's kind of frustrating how, it doesn't sound that original to make these arguments anymore.
Let me ask you an extremely loaded question. And this, like you say, there are many books about this. But tell me how Russia is seen by the Baltic states, and in particular, just how much a sense of unease or fear or anger towards Russia pervades everyday thinking of your average Latvian, Lithuanian, Estonian, Pole, etc. Tell me about just the broader relationship of Russia to the Baltic states and Poland.
I think the really important thing for people from outside the region to understand is that people in the region tend to have very long historical memories, and that this is not a 20th century phenomenon. It is layered, and it goes back the best part of a millennium in some cases. So there will be members of the Estonian elite who will tell you that their country's territory has been attacked by the Russian state or its various precursors more than 40 times since the 12th century AD. And while I've never quite been able to verify that factoid, it's disturbingly plausible. And so this is something that has accumulated over many centuries. And you have to remember, in the Baltic states in particular, their formation of national consciousness in the 19th century was defined against partly a Baltic German landowning elite, but
Right.
very largely against an aggressively Russifying Tsarist imperial occupation. So this is a process that started in the 19th century and was only entrenched by the experience of having to wrest their independence for the first time at the end of the First World War, having to try and preserve it between the hammer and the anvil of Germany and Russia in the interwar period, and then getting occupied twice by the Soviet Union
Right.
in the middle of the 20th century, and basically the experience of the Second World War not ending until 1991. So it is a very, very deep sense of unease that particularly the people in the Baltic states have when they look towards Russia. And another really important thing that I think is often misunderstood outside the region is the concept of fear. I often get asked, are people afraid? And my answer is that as far as I can tell, it's not psychologically possible to live in a state of like edge of your seat fear
Right.
on a generational level for that long. You find an accommodation with it, and you end up with a much kind of calmer and rational approach to risk and to preserving the existence of your country than some of the Western European countries have, I think.
That's a wonderful way to say it. There's sort of that approach to risk as opposed to fear, right? But back to your earlier point about just the reality of how pervasive this history is, and you capture wonderfully when you talk about Kaja Kallas from Estonia, now the EU foreign policy chief, former prime minister. I think it was her mother, correct? Her, as an infant, was exiled to Siberia, and her entire family essentially was viewed as an enemy of the state to the Soviets. And that just made me think, of a recent trip to Latvia with my wife and kids, and we were visiting some extended family out near the Russian border. And I just remember my wife's, I think it was her great aunt, sort of making this whole point of telling the kids that down this road, I remember in the early 1950s when the Russians marched up the road and they marched my father and my mother away to send them into Siberia, right? And you're right. It is just, the memories are not history, right?
For me, Kaja Kallas is very representative of the generation that are currently in charge of the Baltic states, who, if they are drawn from kind of upper middle class backgrounds, it is most likely that at least one grandparent or great grandparent will have been taken to Siberia in the Soviet deportations of the 1940s, and that they will have been kids or teenagers
Right.
during the time when the Baltic states regained their independence. So these incredibly vivid, formative memories of being part of the Baltic Way, this human chain that stretched pretty much unbroken across all three countries. And with that, an incredibly strong appreciation of freedom as something that they have gained within their own lifetimes, and a sense of how fragile that can be, and a sense that history has not come to an end. It is constantly in flux, and it can get better as well as worse. So they don't have the same kind of defensive mindset and fear of change that I often observe, for example, in their German counterparts.
And then that certainly goes a long way to explain why Kaja Kallas in particular has such a no-holds-barred tone towards Putin and towards Russian foreign policy. It certainly explains a lot. Let's flip that question then. Let's look at the Baltics through Moscow's lens, or maybe more accurately, how does Vladimir Putin see the Baltics? And then, but also, how does your average Russian, do you think, sees the Baltic states?
I'm really glad that you draw a distinction between the two, because I think the answers are a bit different, and that's important. So in terms of the ideological portrayal of the Baltic states by the Russian regime, again, deep history is so much more influential than people who haven't traveled much in the region or don't have much experience of it would realize. And what is particularly pertinent to that is the Russian historiography that portrays the Baltic region as a threat to Russia. There they are thinking about things like the invasion by the Teutonic Knights and their Estonian auxiliaries. In the 13th century, that culminated in the famous battle on the ice when Lake Peipus froze over. The Novgorodian general, Alexander Nevsky, is now popping up in statues in places like Mariupol. And then, of course, Polish, Lithuanian, and Swedish incursions all the way up to the Kremlin in the 16th and early 17th centuries are something that are really present in the way that Russian historiography talks about the region. And at the same time, there's another strand that is very important, which is the kind of historiography of the Second World War and the idea that the Russian state has a kind of holy purpose to be fighting this eternal battle against the dark forces of Nazism. And they have very determinedly slotted Ukraine into that role in the current war. But the Baltic states have also been characterized in that way periodically. So you can almost see the ideological ground being laid, the space being created for a casus belli if Putin wanted to do that. In terms of how Putin himself sees the Baltic states, I am not one of the people who believes we can see inside his skull. I think there are far too many confident and completely contradictory assessments of what Putin is thinking by many Russia analysts. I don't pretend to know, but what I do know just out of his biography as objective facts, we know that his father was sent on an almost kind of suicidal sabotage mission behind German lines in Estonia during the Second World War, and most of his father's comrades didn't return alive. His father was seriously injured.
Right.
You have to imagine him growing up in St. Petersburg, the Russian imperial capital, former imperial capital on the Baltic. His wife his ex-wife, I should say, is from Kaliningrad. He is obsessed with history, and in particular with Peter I, the Tsar, who established St. Petersburg and Russia's presence on the Baltic. So I do think you have a sense of that he has a very strong proprietorial interest in the region. When you read his historical essay about the alleged brotherhood and unity of the Kievan Rus and the Muscovite Russian state, that logic really does not apply to the Baltic states. He's very much a product of the late Soviet empire, in which the Baltic republics were always regarded as nasza zagranica, our foreign country, something that was like part of the Soviet sphere and belonged historically to the Russian sphere of influence, but was also alien and kind of almost a bit thrilling in how Western it was, and a kind of uncomfortable body within the Soviet polity. So it definitely has a different status to Ukraine in like the kind of political context that Putin has grown up in.
We can't avoid the topic of Ukraine. So, I mean, everything that you talk about in the book, Ukraine looms over in the background. It's a sort of foundational to so much of what's going on in the region today. When I talk to family and business associates in Latvia in particular, but in the region, they almost universally will say, well, what Ukraine is experiencing, we're next, right? Or the Baltics are next. You spend multiple chapters, and I think you do a wonderful job of talking about the military and the strategic sort of implications of what war would look like and how it would unfold. But tell me, first of all, how Ukraine and what's happened in Ukraine since 2014, but also 2022, how that has changed things in political thinking, but the thinking of the everyday in the Baltics.
I think it's been something that has entrenched concerns and suspicions that had
Sure.
been present in at least the Baltic political elites right from the moment they regained their independence from Russia in 1991. So I don't think it's kind of revolutionized
Sure.
their sense of precariousness or that the existence and integrity of their states is on the line. I think what it has done is given them a strong sense of confidence and their own weight, and the fact that people from larger Western countries are finally starting to listen to them and even to adopt their way of seeing Russia. The other thing that's kind of worth mentioning as a bit of history, the historical background here, is that in the early 90s, the struggles for national independence in the Baltic states and Ukraine were very closely linked to the point where the Baltic independence movements were providing like printed material and strategic advice to their counterparts in Ukraine. And on September 17th, 1989, the Ukrainians actually organized their own counterpart to the Baltic way. So there is a strong sense in which they see their national movements as having been born in the same fire and being kind of tied together.
Indeed, indeed. That's a great way to summarize it. In the book, you spend a significant amount of time looking at the hard security questions, not just questions of identity and nationalism and such, but in particular, when and how Russia could feasibly invade a Baltic state. Walk us through your thinking on that. And has it changed over the past 12 months or so since you wrapped up the book? We have, of course, a fundamental shift in geopolitics with a new president in Washington. But how do you feel? Is an invasion more or less likely? I mean, that is the ultimate loaded question. But essentially, have you changed since you clicked send on the final draft?
Yeah, that's a whole bunch of great questions. When I was researching this like absolutely centrally important issue, it was very important to me to be as concrete and clear as possible about what a war in the Baltic in the 20s would actually look like. Because
Right.
so much of the conversation around deterrence is deliberately abstract on a kind of political and military level. And I wanted to know, what does it look like? What are the capabilities? What are the logistics? Where are the numbers going? Where are these battles putatively actually taking place? So I tried to kind of construct it in as much detail as I could, bearing in mind that it is a set of hypotheticals built
Right.
on hypotheticals. And the conclusion when I finished the manuscript last autumn was that in all probability, if NATO did pull together, and assuming that the national militaries and the NATO multinational groups stationed on their territory and any allies in the neighborhood could hold out for the weeks that it would take NATO to get significant reinforcements into the theater, there would be a good chance of holding a lot of the Baltic states against a Russian incursion. What has changed since then is very simple. It's Trump, is JD Vance's notorious speech at the Munich Security Conference and the implication that if a NATO ally is perceived to be diverging from the kind of MAGA vision of Western civilizational values, whether it be by suppressing alleged dissidents or by being perceived to persecute religious minorities or whatever, as Vance laid out, then the US might suspend its security guarantees. And all of the doubt that Trump has cast on his own commitment to NATO. And that is a very serious and worrying factor to me. And I have been perplexed. And if I'm honest, I've been a bit disappointed by the way that the states on the front line have responded to that. I think it's very understandable that they have done everything in their power to propitiate the US and
Right.
to try and sustain its military commitment to the eastern flank. But it is, in my mind, an extremely urgent priority, if not the most urgent task facing our governments today, to draw up contingency plans for how we protect ourselves if the US isn't coming to help us.
Let's hope that in ministries of defense and Brussels, that exactly what you're talking about is happening. I would have been shocked had you said that you have not changed some of your assessments since you clicked send back in the autumn. Traditionally, of course, when you think of the Baltic states, you think of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. But of course, there are a number of countries that border on the Baltic. You have Finland, Sweden, Poland, of course, Denmark, which you cover, Norway. But tell us the issues that we're discussing here, the Eastern flank, as you put it, they include, and they're just as important to Poland and to the new NATO entrants like Finland and Sweden. And in the book, you lay out a pretty strong case that the Baltic can be seen as, quote, a NATO lake, right? Very inhospitable to the Russians. Help us understand these broader issues. Take us outside of the three traditional Baltic states. And, to me, it seems, wow, you now have a Finland and Sweden as part of NATO, and you have a very, very strong military in Poland. Help us understand how they have changed the equation in the Baltic.
I'm actually not a fan of the Lake NATO meme. I think it was funny when it started out as an internet joke, but I do think it tends to lead people into a false sense of complacency, and that actually, from all of the military analysis that I've read and all the research I've done, it would actually be an extremely messy and hotly contested
Indeed.
battle. But more broadly, it is very clear that the strategic geography of the region is completely different to what it was in January 2022, that the armament of the Polish military becoming the largest conventional army in the European Union, which has been going on for a decade, is a hugely significant factor, even though they are largely set up for their own territorial defense. That revolutions in military affairs that we've been seeing in Germany, especially in the last 6 months, to a degree in Denmark and then Sweden and Finland, discarding centuries of military non-alignment in Sweden's case and joining NATO, have really profoundly changed how we think about the Baltic region as a strategic theater. It opens up all kinds of new lines of communication and reinforcement and possibilities for area denial. But one of the questions I would put to pretty much every interviewee on the security stuff when I was researching the book was, do you feel safer now than you did before the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine? And what was fascinating was that the answers completely diverged. They were all over the place. That all of these kind of strategic changes to NATO's favor have been balanced out by the sheer shock of what we've been seeing in Ukraine. So it's very difficult to answer whether the net result of all of these changes has been in NATO's favor in the region or not.
Do feel like the overall media narrative is now you have a very highly capable military in Finland, and a rapidly sort of improving military in Sweden that are now part of NATO, which I doubt that Putin assumed that would happen back in February of 2022. But you're saying it's not as simple as that, right? Of that you've just added thousands of kilometers of NATO border with Russia and some very capable troops, but it's not as simple as that.
No, I mean, everything that you've just said is true, and those are strategic gains for NATO and for the Baltic states, unambiguously.
Right.
But what I'm saying is that the flip side of that equation is what we've been seeing on the battlefields of Ukraine in terms of how Russia uses its own strategic advantages, and in particular its willingness to expend absolutely heinous numbers of its own people in order to achieve its objectives.
Right. Which certainly Finland and Sweden and such would not be willing to do, right? These human wave attacks are just sort of the meat grinder approach to war making that the Russians have done. So I think that is a very, very valid point. We're talking here about Poland, of course, which is a whole nother subject for another podcast. It's, absolutely fascinating what they've done from a security and policy and increasing their military capacity. But you're the Times correspondent in Berlin. And throughout the book, you capture so well, I would say maybe the tortured relationship that Germany has with the questions we're discussing. How aggressive should they be in their foreign policy? How much should they try to militarize a pretty pacifistic society? Is there a real appetite amongst German policymakers and such, but also the people, to carry a big stick? It's almost like Germany remains very uncomfortable in their own skin. Tell me about how to think about Germany's role in this story.
Yeah, so there's a version of this answer that's totally legitimate and starts in the 12th century and goes on for 2.5 days, which I will spare you and the listeners. Let's start this story in the early 1970s with Willy Brandt, the first social
Right.
democratic chancellor of West Germany, where he came up with a policy known as Ostpolitik, detente towards
Right.
the Soviet Union, and that was largely built around the kind of energy relationship initially through Soviet oil pipelines running into West Germany. And there is a reading of modern German history, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the 1990s, that was absolutely dominant in the German elite until 2022 and still persists in parts of the German elite today, that holds that Ostpolitik was the decisive factor in the fall of the Berlin Wall and German reunification.
Right.
And a whole bunch of complexes, therefore, around the role of the German military, the value of force as opposed to dialogue, Germany's historical obligations towards Moscow, a profound sense of gratitude towards Russia for letting German reunification happen. And what we have had since the start of 2022 has been the initial profound shock of what happened in Ukraine that led Olaf Scholz, the chancellor of the time, to declare the Zeitenwende, the so-called shift in German defense policy, which was basically stillborn beyond the two initial commitments to create the 100 billion euro special fund for rearmament and to ultimately raise defense spending to 2% of GDP. And then the second shock was Trump's return to the White House and the very hostile language towards European NATO allies in general, but also Germany specifically. And that has led to a genuine revolution in German policy. They have effectively created the fiscal space for unlimited borrowing for defense spending. They've put themselves on a path to spend 3.5% of GDP on the military by 2029 at the earliest.
Right.
They are upgrading their NATO battle group in Lithuania to a full-scale brigade with 5,000 troops. And we are seeing, by German standards, an incredibly rapid evolution towards the Baltic norm, right? The Germans are becoming more Baltic here. And in the Germany chapter of the book, I was very kind of pessimistic about the kind of morass that they seem to be stuck in politically and how they're going around in circles. But under the new Chancellor Friedrich Merz, they've really broken out of that in security terms, at least in a very kind of positive and dynamic way.
Your positive feeling towards Merz and sort of the direction of travel, is that reciprocated, do you think, by his peers in Poland and the Baltic states? Do they feel that Germany maybe has turned the corner and could be a genuine partner, or is it still early days?
I talked to them a lot about this question, and they are cautiously optimistic, but in the light of modern German history, and in particular, given the fact that he is governing with the Social Democratic Party, which still has a lot of hang-ups on these issues, they overwhelmingly still say, well, let's wait and see. Signals are good. The rhetoric is good. The German leadership in Europe under Merz has been good. The defense spending is great. But let's just see if he fulfills all of these promises and puts his money where his mouth is.
Exactly. Boots on the ground, which we are seeing in Lithuania. I mean, that's a sea change. Am I not mistaken to have a permanently based German armored battle group outside German borders, right? And
it's the first permanent deployment of this kind, of this scale outside Germany's borders since 1945.
Right.
It's huge.
Yeah. Let me pose a hypothetical. It's 2030. Let's presume, hope, pray that war has not come about between Russia and the Baltic and NATO states. Maybe hopefully there's been some sort of ceasefire or peace in Ukraine, and Donald Trump is obviously no longer in office if he follows constitutional strictures. What do you think you'll be saying when you describe the Baltic states then? Heavily loaded question, could be answered for an hour, but the direction of travel of the Baltic states, everything we've discussed here is so driven by security and by the actions of others. Whereas you make a very good case and, you highlight, for example, Estonia's amazing economic reforms, its embrace of digital technology and such. That's also important to consider, not just the hard security. How will we be describing the Baltic states in 5 to 10 years? Will it still be driven completely by security? Or is there other lenses that we should look at it?
What makes me extremely uncomfortable is the extent to which the answer to that question is out of our hands
Right.
as Europeans.
Right.
The extent to which it is contingent on what happens in Ukraine, if there is a ceasefire or some kind of provisional peace deal, on what terms, what is Trump doing, how committed is he to NATO, how much scope does Putin have to believe that he can work towards his long-term strategic goal of weakening the alliance or
Right.
even potentially kind of pushing it back in Europe. And I can't answer those questions, and it really bothers me that so much of that is out of our hands. But assuming that those two factors remain stable, I still think that until Russia suffers some kind of catastrophic defeat that forces a reassessment of what it is as a country and what it's there for,
Sure.
on a similar scale to what we saw in Germany after 1945, it will still be there as a major security threat to NATO's eastern flank and to the Baltic states in particular. And I think the conversation will still be dominated by security questions. That said, I'm glad you raised the other aspects, and in particular the kind of technological dynamism that we've seen, not just from Estonia, but from all
Right.
three
Of
Baltic
course.
states. That is something that is already being strongly thematized in other Western European countries. And in my home country, Britain, for example, there's a lot of focus on Estonian early years education and on their school system, which now has the best exam results in Europe. So I think this trajectory of a growing recognition of what these societies have created in terms of human capital over the past 35 years, that will continue. And I hope as well that economic growth begins to pick up again, because especially for Estonia, these have been fallow years over the past decade.
It's depressing, but also unsurprising to hear you say that essentially security and geopolitics is the framework for thinking about the Baltics. Before I ask my final question, this has been sort of lingering in my head since you mentioned your bit of unease with how the Baltic states have responded to the Trump administration. Because, like we were just saying, these existential security questions will certainly be based on what happens in Moscow, of course, but also what happens in Washington. And you were saying that you were a bit uneasy with that. And maybe is that just the sense of how they have prostrated themselves too much in front of Washington, or is it their message is not getting through? Because I'm thinking of a remark I read in the FT or something in the past week or two, which referred to Finnish President Alexander Stubb as the Trump
Mm.
whisperer in chief. Is that true, or is that just tell me a little bit more about your assertion on that front?
Yeah, so it's actually none of the things you mentioned. I think it's super clear that the strategic priority for all of these frontline states, and I use that in the extended sense that includes places like Denmark, is absolutely to keep the US as committed as they can. And obviously, all of this is pending the results of the Pentagon's posture review, which is being led by Elbridge Colby, who is not known for his sympathy
Yeah, right.
towards the kind of Eastern members of NATO. And of course, that's their priority. And if it were just a question of sucking up to Trump and calling him daddy and giving him generous trade terms, that would totally be a price worth
Right.
paying. What bothers me is more the very specific dilemma that while they are doing this, as they absolutely should be, in my view, there is also an imperative to ensure that Europe can stand on its own 2 feet in deterrence terms. And the easy part of that politically is hiring more troops and buying more
Right.
kit. The hard part of that politically is making sure that you've got the political, the military, the intelligence structures in Europe that you would need to mount a defense of the eastern flank if the
Of
Americans
course.
don't turn
Okay.
up.
Right.
And that is like a politically hugely sensitive topic, but I think it is a conversation that is absolutely necessary and of existential importance for the Europeans as a whole, but for the frontline states in particular. So my disappointment is that from all the conversations I've had, there is not much discussion going on about this, or if there is, it is very clandestine. And also that you would hope the intellectual energy driving this process would come from the states that have the most to lose, that have the
Mhm.
most on the line, precisely these frontline states. And I just don't see it there at the moment.
Very interesting. Now, thank you for clarifying that. Well, last question, my friend, and this is what I always ask all of our guests. And you had mentioned that there's a plethora of books around some of the topics we've discussed. But I always ask our guests to recommend 1 to 2 books that will help us better understand what they're focusing on. Of course, that's for you as the Baltic, but also Germany, of course. What should be in our nightstand to help us better understand these issues? Maybe 1 to 2 books, fiction, nonfiction. Give us your thoughts.
Yeah, so just for the very deep history and to get a sense of what this world was once like, Eric Christiansen's book, The Northern Crusades, is just such a fantastically vivid account of how the Baltic world once was. And in a similar vein, Peter K. Massey's monumental biography of Peter the First
Okay.
just has the most compelling account of the Great Northern War and how kind of central that has been to the kind of modern Russian understanding of the region. But if you just want to understand where we're at right now, there is literally a book called Understanding the Baltic States that came out a couple of years ago from the Cambridge Centre for Geopolitics Baltic faculty, edited by Charles Clarke, the former UK Home Secretary. I've dealt with them a lot. It contains a lot of very insightful and interesting essays, and you won't go wrong if you start with that.
Fantastic. Great recommendations. And I will put those in the show notes, of course. Thank you so much for your time and your thoughts. And I wish you the best of luck with the book. And I hope maybe we can have this conversation again, because I would imagine if we have these same questions in 6 months' time, we could have some very different answers.
Well, thank you for the super insightful questions. I think they really made the conversation tick.
Cheers, my friend. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much.